December 7, 1941. At 7:48 a.m., the United States Navy ceased to exist in the form it had trusted for 40 years. In less than 2 hours, 8 battleships were sunk or crippled at Pearl Harbor. Over 2,400 Americans were dead, and something even more important lay wrecked beneath the burning oil: the belief that battleships still ruled the sea. 9 days later, in Washington, President Franklin D. Roosevelt made a decision that stunned the Navy's senior leadership. He passed over 28 more senior admirals. He ignored the battleship elite, and he handed the broken Pacific Fleet to a quiet Texan submariner, Chester William Nimitz, a man many believed was unqualified, too cautious, and completely wrong for the moment. This is the story of why Roosevelt chose the admiral nobody wanted, and how that decision quietly reshaped modern warfare.
By December 1941, the United States Navy was the most powerful battleship fleet on Earth, and utterly unprepared for the war it had just entered. For 40 years, American naval doctrine revolved around a single assumption: that decisive wars at sea would be settled by battleship engagements, line against line, gun against gun. This belief shaped shipbuilding, promotions, and prestige. Carriers were auxiliaries, submarines were scouts, logistics was an afterthought. Pearl Harbor exposed the fatal flaw in that thinking. Japan had not challenged the battleship line. It had bypassed it entirely, using aircraft carriers, long-range planning, and operational surprise. In the aftermath, blame fell fast and hard. Admiral Husband Kimmel in Hawaii was relieved. General Walter Short was disgraced. But in Washington, the deeper failure was understood quietly. The system itself had failed. The question Roosevelt now faced was not who had lost the fleet, but who could build an entirely new one while the war was already underway.
Inside the Navy Department, the expected candidates were obvious: senior battleship admirals, men with decades of command at sea, men who embodied the traditions Pearl Harbor had just destroyed. At the top stood Admiral Ernest J. King, brilliant, abrasive, feared. King would soon become Commander-in-Chief U.S. Fleet. But King did not want the Pacific Command for himself. He wanted a fighter, someone who could execute ruthlessly, without ego. Others were passed over for quieter reasons. Some were too rigid, some too cautious, some too closely tied to the battleship orthodoxy. And then there was Chester Nimitz, a bureau chief in Washington, a submariner by training, a man who had once run a destroyer aground and nearly ended his career, a 2-star admiral without a single battleship command to his name. Many senior officers considered him a logistical clerk, not a fleet commander. Even Nimitz himself had declined the Pacific post once before. But Roosevelt saw something the Navy hierarchy did not.
Franklin Roosevelt did not choose Nimitz by accident. He chose him by memory. Before the presidency, Roosevelt had served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy during World War I. He understood shipyards, personnel, logistics, and, most importantly, the difference between rank and competence. He remembered Nimitz as a man who solved problems quietly, a specialist in propulsion, submarines, and long-range operations, a pioneer of underway replenishment, the ability to fuel and supply ships at sea far from ports. Roosevelt knew the Pacific War would not be won by prestige. It would be won by endurance, by intelligence, by logistics, and by commanders willing to give second chances, because war would demand them. On December 17, 1941, Roosevelt approved the order. Chester W. Nimitz would take command of the Pacific Fleet.
He would arrive at Pearl Harbor on Christmas Day to inherit a fleet still burning and a war already moving west.
Chester Nimitz arrived at Pearl Harbor on Christmas Day, 1941. There was no ceremony, no band, no speeches. The harbor still smelled of oil and burned steel. Sunken battleships lay half visible beneath the waterline, their masts protruding like grave markers. Salvage crews worked silently, knowing that some ships would never sail again. Nimitz did not tour the damage for appearances. He asked questions. Which dry docks were still usable? Which fuel tanks had survived? How quickly ships could be repaired, not restored, but returned to action. That afternoon, he gathered the remaining officers and delivered a brief message. The war starts now. No blame was assigned, no public reprimands issued. The men many expected him to fire were told to stay. It shocked nearly everyone, but Nimitz understood something critical. He needed continuity more than revenge. The fleet had not been defeated by cowardice, it had been defeated by assumptions, and those could be corrected.
Nimitz's first major decision was also his most controversial. He retained much of the existing Pacific Fleet staff, officers associated, fairly or not, with Pearl Harbor. To critics, it looked like weakness. To Nimitz, it was experience he could not afford to lose. Years earlier, Nimitz himself had ran the destroyer USS Decatur aground in the Philippines. By naval tradition, such a mistake could end a career. Instead, he was reprimanded and given another chance. That experience stayed with him. It shaped how he judged men under pressure. Nimitz believed that war demanded learning faster than the enemy. That meant retaining officers who understood Pacific geography, Japanese tactics, and logistical realities, even if their reputations were damaged. Where others would purge, Nimitz refined. Where others demanded certainty, he accepted calculated risk. Quietly, he began reshaping the fleet's culture, not around seniority, not around tradition, but around adaptability. It was not dramatic, but it was decisive.
The disaster at Pearl Harbor was not solely a failure in Hawaii. It was a failure of information and of communication originating in Washington. American codebreakers had been reading parts of Japanese diplomatic traffic through the purple cipher, but critical intercepts were compartmentalized, delayed, or never forwarded. Admiral Harold Stark, Chief of Naval Operations, was soon dispatched to London. General George Marshall would later give evasive testimony about the timing of warnings. Neither Admiral Kimmel nor General Short ever saw the most sensitive intelligence. Nimitz understood this history and drew a sharp lesson from it. Intelligence was useless unless commanders trusted it and could act on it quickly. Under his command, intelligence would not sit in Washington. It would move with the fleet. This decision, quiet and administrative, would soon prove more powerful than any battleship. By early 1942, the transformation was undeniable. Battleships were no longer the center of American naval planning. Aircraft carriers, once dismissed as support vessels, became the fleet's primary striking arm. Submarines shifted from scouting to commerce warfare, strangling Japanese supply lines. And logistics, fuel, ammunition, repair ships, moved to the center of strategy. This was not theoretical. It was operational reality. Nimitz accelerated underway replenishment, allowing task forces to remain at sea for weeks. He prioritized mobility over mass, flexibility over formality. Many senior officers resisted the change. Some never accepted it. But Nimitz did not argue doctrine. He let results speak. By spring of 1942, Japan's advance, once unstoppable, was slowing. Not because of a single battle, but because the war it expected to fight no longer existed.
Ernest J. King was not an easy man to impress. As Commander-in-Chief, U.S. Fleet, he had little patience for caution or indecision.
He believed wars were won by offensive action, immediately and relentlessly. King had concerns about Nimitz. The Pacific commander was quiet, methodical, uninclined to theatrics. To King, this looked dangerously close to hesitation. But King also watched results. Within weeks, the Pacific Fleet, once immobilized, was operational again. Carrier task forces were rotating at sea. Submarines were pressing westward despite flawed torpedoes. Logistic ships were moving where none had before. Nimitz was not waiting for perfection. He was building capability while fighting. King did not praise him. He rarely praised anyone. But the objections stopped. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, Washington sensed that the Pacific War had found its footing.
Nimitz understood that the United States could not yet meet Japan head-on. The fleet was still outnumbered. Carrier strength was limited. Air crews were inexperienced. So he chose a different approach. Small, sharp strikes, carrier raids against the Marshall and Gilbert Islands. Limited attacks designed not to win territory, but to test doctrine, train crews, and force Japan to react. These operations unsettled Tokyo. They revealed that the American fleet was not passive. More importantly, they exposed Japanese assumptions about range, readiness, and response time. Every raid produced data. Every mistake was recorded. Every success refined a system. To critics, the raids looked inconclusive. To Nimitz, they were rehearsals. The Pacific Fleet was not yet strong enough to gamble everything, but it was learning how.
While ships maneuvered at sea, another transformation unfolded quietly ashore. Nimitz elevated intelligence from a support function to a command weapon. He placed unusual trust in cryptanalysis at Pearl Harbor, men like Commander Joseph Rochefort. Japanese naval communications, coded as JN-25, were only partially broken. But patterns emerged. Timing, call signs, operational rhythms. Nimitz did not demand certainty. He demanded probability. Where others waited for confirmation, he asked what the enemy believed. Where others dismissed incomplete data, he asked how it could be exploited. This approach ran against Navy tradition. It required commanders to act without full information, and to accept responsibility if the judgment was wrong. Nimitz accepted that risk himself. For the first time, intelligence and operations were fused at the highest level, and the consequences would soon be irreversible.
By April 1942, Japanese movements hinted at something larger. A pattern was forming, but not yet fully visible. American carriers had survived. Japanese planners had not expected that. In Tokyo, confidence remained high, but assumptions were beginning to crack. Nimitz sensed an opportunity, not for a decisive blow, but for a calculated gamble. It would require trust in intelligence that was incomplete, committing scarce carriers far from support, and accepting that failure could set the war back a year or worse. No battleship commander would have attempted it. This was a decision born not of doctrine, but of necessity. Nimitz did not announce it. He did not seek consensus. He prepared quietly, knowing that the next move would determine whether Pearl Harbor was a beginning or the end.
The fragments of intelligence pointed toward a target Japan considered unavoidable. A small atoll, minimal defenses, strategically exposed. Midway. For Japanese planners, Midway was the key to drawing out the remaining American carriers. For Nimitz, it was the one place where incomplete intelligence could still be decisive. Intercepted messages referred to an objective labeled AF. Washington was unconvinced. The data was fragmentary, the risk enormous. So Nimitz authorized a test, a false message was sent from Midway, reporting a breakdown in the island's water distillation system. Within days, Japanese intercepts confirmed that AF was short on water. It was enough. Nimitz now knew where the blow would fall. What he did not know was how strong it would be, or whether his own forces could survive the encounter.
The plan Nimitz approved violated nearly every principle of pre-war naval doctrine. He would commit all available carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the damaged Yorktown, against a Japanese force believed to be superior in numbers, experience, and aircraft. There would be no battleship strain, no margin for error, no replacement force if the carriers were lost. Yorktown, heavily damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea, was given just 72 hours of repairs. Shipyard workers labored around the clock. What could not be fixed was improvised. To Washington, the risk bordered on reckless. To King, it was bold, but necessary. Nimitz accepted full responsibility. If the gamble failed, the Pacific would be defenseless. But he believed Japan would fight the battle it had planned, not the one it was about to face.
As Japanese forces moved east, American carriers slipped into position north of Midway. Radio silence was absolute. Nimitz remained at Pearl Harbor. He did not command from the bridge of a ship. He commanded through preparation. His orders to the carrier commanders were precise, but flexible. He did not dictate tactics. He defined intent. The Japanese believed the American fleet was still reeling from Coral Sea. They believed surprise was assured. They were wrong. On June 3rd, Midway-based aircraft sighted the approaching enemy. The reports were imperfect, the distances uncertain. But the moment had arrived. For the first time in the Pacific War, the United States Navy was not reacting. It was waiting.
On the morning of June 4, 1942, the battle unfolded in chaos. American torpedo squadrons attacked first and were devastated. Planes were shot down almost to the last man. The losses were catastrophic. Then, at precisely the wrong moment for Japan, American dive bombers arrived overhead. Within minutes, 3 Japanese carriers were burning. A 4th would follow. The balance of the Pacific War shifted in a single morning. This was not luck. It was positioning. It was intelligence. It was preparation under uncertainty. Nimitz did not witness the battle directly, but every condition that made it possible bore his imprint. Midway did not end the war, but it ended Japan's ability to control it, and it answered finally the question asked after Pearl Harbor, why Roosevelt chose the admiral nobody wanted.
Midway did not end the Pacific War, but it changed its direction permanently. Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, hundreds of experienced aviators, and, most critically, the initiative. The United States, still outnumbered, now dictated the tempo. Nimitz did not celebrate. He understood that victory at Midway created responsibility, not relief. The war that followed would be long, attritional, and unforgiving. It would be decided not by dramatic engagements, but by sustained pressure across thousands of miles of ocean. Under Nimitz, the Pacific Campaign became a system. Island by island, supply line by supply line, carrier task force by carrier task force. This was not a war built for headlines. It was built for endurance. And endurance, more than brilliance, would decide the outcome. In the Pacific, 2 American commanders would dominate public attention. Douglas MacArthur, dramatic, defiant, and politically astute, fought a war of declarations and returns. Chester Nimitz fought a war of movement, logistics, and quiet coordination. Their strategies diverged, their personalities clashed. But Nimitz avoided rivalry. He focused on integration. His command absorbed new carriers as they arrived, integrated submarines into a relentless commerce war,
and synchronized intelligence, air power, and supply at a scale never attempted before. The victories that followed, Guadalcanal, the Central Pacific Drive, the Philippine Sea, were not improvisations. They were the product of a system built after Pearl Harbor, a system designed by a man who did not seek attention and did not need it.
Nimitz never fit the popular image of wartime leadership. He did not deliver fiery speeches. He did not cultivate myth. He delegated authority and accepted dissent. His greatest strength, trust, made him difficult to dramatize. He relied on subordinates, listened to intelligence officers, accepted responsibility when others might deflect it. Even after the war, his contributions were often overshadowed by more visible figures. But professional navies understood his impact immediately. Modern carrier warfare, operational intelligence integration, sustained forward logistics. These were not accidental developments. They were the result of decisions made under extreme uncertainty by a commander who understood that wars are not won by heroes, but by systems that function under pressure.
When Roosevelt chose Nimitz in December 1941, he was not choosing a savior. He was choosing a manager of uncertainty. Roosevelt understood that Pearl Harbor had not just destroyed ships, it had destroyed assumptions. The Navy did not need tradition. It needed adaptation. Nimitz represented something rare in senior command, the ability to accept incomplete information and still act decisively. That is why rank was ignored, why seniority was bypassed, why a quiet submariner was entrusted with the largest ocean war in history. Roosevelt's decision was not dramatic, it was calculated, and history would prove it correct.
Chester W. Nimitz never claimed credit for victory in the Pacific. He insisted the war was won by sailors, aviators, engineers, and codebreakers. But the structure that allowed them to succeed was his. When the United States Navy emerged from World War II, it was no longer a battleship force. It was a carrier navy, an intelligence-driven navy, a global logistics machine. That transformation began not with triumph, but with disaster, and with a decision made 9 days after Pearl Harbor. Roosevelt chose the admiral nobody wanted, because the war ahead required a commander nobody expected. History would remember the battles, but the victory was decided before them.